Shalom, family. I am reading Initiation into Yoga, Introduction to the Spiritual Life by Sri Krishna Prem. What is yoga not? Yoga is not a lotus position. Yoga is not a system of exercises. Yoga is not a vacating of the mental processes. Yoga is not an abdication of living the physical life. Yoga is not a mysterious meditative state of consciousness. Yoga is not exclusively for the spiritually cultured citizen. What then is yoga according to Sri Krishna Prem? Yoga is nothing but an intense relating to life. The aspirant must therefore guard himself carefully against any tendency to separate himself from his fellows. He must strive always to feel himself into the hearts of those he meets in his daily life. Surely these words are a far cry from what we are used to reading in the great array of yogic studies now available to the Western world. Initiation into yoga is indeed a living experience between author and reader, therefore, a legitimate yogic experience in itself. Here is the legacy of a remarkable and beloved man, Sri Krishna Prem, guru yet student, mystic yet earthy, is a co-author of Man, the Measure of All Things, with his close friend and associate, Sir Madhva Ashish, who in his turn adds meaningfully to this book with his picture preface, an intimate sketch of the human and humane side of the author, a searching study of the anatomy of the yogic discipline and the yogi as practitioner. That's the back of the book. The contents. Chapter 1 is Initiation into Yoga. Chapter 2, Symbolism and Knowledge. Chapter 3, The Sacred Marriage. Chapter 4, The Forgotten Land. Chapter 5, Doubts and Their Removal. Chapter 6, Past, Present, and Future. Chapter 7, Superstition. Chapter 8, The Violence of War. Chapter 9, Religion and Philosophy. Forward. Sri Krishna Prem through the eyes of a disciple. In the present day, extraordinary dress is no longer the sign of an extraordinary man. It is in the fashion to wear weird clothes. India is flooded with foreign freaks in various stages of dress and undress, hairy and shorn, many with greater or less sincerity, adopting the role of the wandering mendicant monk, the sannyasi or sadhu. In the 1920s, however, when Ronald Nixon, later to become Sri Krishna Prem, came to India to teach at Lucknow University, the number of Europeans who broke through the restraints of the Sahib social solidarity could be counted on the fingers of one hand. A white skin in Indian dress was more often a grotesque parody, the unhappy victim of leucoderma, a disease that destroys the pigment in the skin. By 1942, when I reached India, the system of social restraints was beginning to crack. The old guard could no longer control the behavior of the thousands of young Englishmen who swarmed over the subcontinent of wartime tasks. Through the cracks, some of us found our way into the strange world of Indian saints, semi-saints, and downright frauds. We found ourselves afloat without a compass on an ocean to which we had no charts, where the winds of the spirit blew the fortunate to port and the unfortunate sank. But though I met Europeans who had taken to the Indian manner of living, and though I had myself at times worn Indian dress, in 4 years I never set eyes on any non Indian who had taken the plunge into Orthodox Indian sannyas. When Sri Krishna Prem strode barefoot onto the veranda of Almora's one Western style hotel, where I was having a very English tea with a very English old lady, the apparition fitted none of my categories, so I retired to watch from behind in self protective grin. 6 foot, big bone, but soft fibered, blue eyed, a high domed, shaven head, with a stubble of white hair, yet a lot of the pinko white Anglo-Saxon skin that goes red in the sun, showing the gaps of his ochre garments. It was a remarkable, if not yet startling appearance. A man in his late 40s. He seemed to be entirely ease in himself and to assume that others would be similarly so, in spite of a discrepancy between his dress and the setting he had entered. He talked brilliantly, learnedly, wittedly. It was an impressive show, and I recognized the professionalism of a man who has trained himself to hold the attention of a class of students or a group of questioners. Two of us was too small an audience, and the eerie blue eye turned from one to the other, looking through, not at once. Later I grew fearful of those eyes, having learned that they really did look through one. For a moment I was on guard with bared teeth, and though I admired his evident learning, I felt his intelligence rise up between us like polished armor. I had not met the man. I had first heard of him some 3 years earlier while on vacation in Ranakhet, a military cantonment in the Himalayan foothills 30 miles from Almora. The British still referred to him by his English name, Nixon, and coupled it with that of Alexander, his friend and disciple. My host described them as two Cambridge intellectuals living in the interior, and they disliked visitors. Then in Calcutta, I ran across a few people who had visited the ashram, and I heard somewhat derogatory comments. They were intellectuals, rituals, Orthodox Hindus, devotees, yet it seemed that all had been impressed and were trying to depotentialize the challenge of what they had seen by taking a depreciatory attitude. I was left with an impression that Krishna Prem was something to be reckoned with. As I have said, however, we were afloat without a compass. We followed our noses, and some noses were put out of the joint by Krishna Prem's flagrant violent violation of the then accepted code of British superiority. He had gone native, but done it in such a superior way that no British mud flung at him would stick. He had done his share of fighting in the First World War. He was a successful professor of English literature, much loved and admired by his Indian students. His disciple and companion, Major Alexander, was a highly qualified physician in the Indian Medical Service, whose premature retirement as principal of the Lucknow Medical College had upset the Lucknow public. Krishna Prem Guru Shri Yashoda Mai was Mrs. Chakravarti, wife of the ex-vice chancellor of Lucknow University. With the end of the war in the fast east, my job as a civilian aircraft technician crawled to a finish. Roads led in any directions. I was 26 and had 4 months leave to my credit to give myself time to decide whether life might offer more than just another job. I set out for Almora. There, cheap, quiet accommodations in scattered bungalows facing the Himalayan peaks, far from military cantonments, had attracted a number of Western people whose eccentricities, that's a word, had earned for the area the name Cranks Ridge. They were elderly people who shared a wide range of interests: art, literature, religion, and they wished to live quietly. Their intelligence was of a high order, and their experience of life full and varied. In their youth, they might have passed through the periods of starry eyed enthusiasm and blind devotion, but now each of his way was solidly devoted to somewhat amorphous path, which was distilled from the public religious teachings. All encouraged me in my groping inquiries, but none attempted to enlist me in his particular thing. And I found, whenever I pressed a question beyond the limits of their experience, that each would quietly and benignly reply. And Sri Krishna Prem returns asks him. Sri Krishna Prem was away in the plains and would soon return to the ashram. Since his guru's death 2 years earlier, he was the head of it. The ashram was not on Cranks Ridge, but 20 miles away by Bridle Path, Bridle Path, on the other side of the deep valley. A white spot high up on the wooded hills. A few of the community of Cranks knew Krishna Prem well, but the others had only a slight acquaintance to him, and this made their separately repeated advice for the more impressive. By the time he arrived, he was ready to look on him as a demigod. But by the end of that first meeting on the hotel veranda, I was not at all sure that my friends were right. Another afternoon tea in Almora marked my first meeting with Moti Rani, Krishna Prem's first disciple and the youngest daughter of his guru. She was short and fat, with a typically round Bengali head, dark skin, poor features by the canons of Indian beauty, but magnificent, fine skin, and hands that artists wanted to borrow. Her feet, deformed at birth, had been straightened out by treatment and looked normal enough, but she walked with the waddle and might fall over like a tin soldier at the slightest provocation. Her brief marriage had ended with her finding her husband another wife, and then, after her father's death, she had made her home at her mother's ashram. Krishna Prem, who had known her since she was a little girl in a pink frock, was her little father, and she treated him with an affectionate familiarity, mm, which made it plain that his glittering intellectual armor was not vulnerable. They seemed as oddly assorted pair to be traveling together. Krishna Prem in his rough and ill-washed homespun cotton, shaving only on Mondays and Fridays, feet calloused and cracked, uh, imperturbably sitting like a sacred bull on a city pavement and puffing at a pipe, his one unsadhu-like luxury, in which, as he said, he smoked not tobacco but matches and moti in Benares embroidered silk sari, uh, with bobbed hair and jewelry, delicate, dynamic, vivacious, and the center of attention as by right. Within 10 minutes of our meeting, Moti was teasing me about the recal- recalcitrant forelook, which the dry hill air made unmanageable. I made a shameful excuse and tried to sink out of sight behind a row of brightly colored cushions, only to find them stuffed with pine needles. Esther Merston, an elderly English lady who was my hostess on the ridge, kept up a running chatter of rarefied intellectuals in her precise, opinionated way. In the pauses, Moti would return to that damned forelook with a giggling, but tell me why you don't cut it off. When my tormentor desisted, I heard Esther inviting herself along with me to a week's stay at the ashram. During the week, I waited before making our trip. Krishna Prem's friend, variously known as Major Robert Dudley Alexander, IMS Dr. Sahib, or more familiarly, Bob, passed on by the pilgrimage to Badrinath, an ancient temple in the high Himalayas, almost as tall as Krishna Prem, with blue eyes deep set behind shaggy eyebrows. Lean and bony, he was bounding along on the balls of his bare feet to cover 120 miles each way in the next fortnight. Just after the First World War, he and Ronald Nixon had met in the Cambridge bookshop, both hunting for one of H.P. Blavatsky's theosophical works. Uh, at that instant, Bob said, I felt I had met a man I could follow for the rest of my life. Follow him he did, though his long medical course delayed his coming to India till the next year. Nixon took sannyas and became Sri Krishna Prem, and as Yashoda Mai foretold at their first meeting. It was another 10 years before Bob was ready to join the ashram. Bobby had covered the distance from the ashram to Almora in 5 hours. It took my hostess and me the best part of 9, elderly Esther and Almora's one elderly horse, and me trying to emulate the odd Englishmen of the ashram by going barefoot. It was a tiring journey, 9 miles down one side of a valley and 9 miles of unremitting climb up the other. A hot, dusty, bridled path winding past terraces of rubble soil where women were harvesting yellow millet and scarlet cockscomb. Then the road led up into pine forest, which changed to oak, where the air grew cold and thin. Krishna Prem had laughingly directed us to take the middle path, which avoided the steepest part of the climb, which but we missed it. We missed it in a maze of cow tracks and eventually arrived at a lonely, crumbling building high on the hill where two well kept dogs barked furiously at our intrusion. A man who emerged from the building grudgingly admitted that they belonged to the ashram and led us down path dilapidated terraces towards the temple, a temple dome that was not now showing through the trees. In general, I am sympathetic to the idea that first impressions are significant. During this period, however, either my small intuitive faculty was dormant or the new impressions were too small and numerous for me to handle. I was suspicious of Krishna Prem, abashed by the moti, and now I was repelled by the dead gray cement of the temple dome, the rusted iron roofing of an upper story that leaned against it, and the brown painted verandas clad with iron sheet weatherproofing. It was drab, but the drab temple rose an 8 feet high sea of flowering cosmos and marigolds, a garden that had run wild. We were put up in a stone roofed bungalow called the school from the time when Krishna Prem's guru taught village children reading, writing, and the element of English, which were then the keys to employment. Now it was used as a guest house, but guests were few. The place smelled of damp cedar wood and was crowded with bits of furniture not wanted elsewhere. Pictures of no one wanted to look at, and old magazines no one wanted to read. I, I had heard so much about their rigid orthodoxy at the ashram that I hesitated to approach the temple proper, lest I be chased away as an untouchable. So my first view of the evening service was from a distance, the din of gongs, bells, and the kettle drum was strangely stirring, as was the half glimpsed form of Krishna Prem's offering the symbols of the elements amidst clouds of incense. The inner shrine was lit up like a glowing cave in the October night, and then the lights and incense were carried out to be offered at the newly constructed samadhi, which housed the ashes of the guru and founder of the ashram. After the evening service, they sang in the temple anteroom, Krishna Prem leading and accompanying himself on a small harmonium, and the moti repeating each line of the song, as is the custom in such communal singing, which was a different man. The intellectual barriers were down, and emotion flooded him and throbbed through the temple. It was not the cheap, hysterical auto excitation one finds in many hymn singing communities. It was the outpouring of an individual's soul in longing for union with the divine beloved. There were times when he would lose himself in song and then sit in the numinous silence until normal consciousness returned. Later, I heard from Moti how he had been known to leap up and dance till he fell senseless. My reaction on these early occasions was to curl up inside myself, lest My own inhibited feelings dare show themselves. There followed a long wait on the draughty upper veranda while Krishna Prem first performed his sandhya, the major daily Hindu practice, and then prepared the evening meal. We had to retire from the veranda while the food was carried past to the temple, lest we defile it with hungry looks. After another long wait, while the ritual offerings were performed, we were at last invited to eat a simple meal of chapatis made from local flour, a dish of potatoes, and a little milk. There were few things that upset the whole being of a man so much as deprivation of food or irregular and unaccustomed meal times. The old world and India is still part of it, with this religious fast and only the sun 4 o'clock kept the digestive system flexible. I have been one of those unfortunate brats who collapsed from hunger at early morning chapel at school. Now I was giving I was given ample opportunity for resentment against this calm man, Krishna Prem, who seemed indifferent to what he ate or even whether he ate at all. After rising at 5 so as to bathe before the morning service, one was kept waiting for tea until Krishna Prem finished his morning meditation, which might last until 10. Supper came after his evening meditation and the temple offerings. Only the main midday meal was reasonably on time. Moti, who looked to treat even the making of a cup of tea as an adventure, found my irritability over delayed meals intolerable. Until food had been offered to Sri Krishna in the temple and until the Guru was ready, no member of the ashram was supposed to take so much as a sip of water. With swimming head and grumbling stomach, I sullenly obeyed, because there was no alternative except to leave. During this first visit, there was a lot of talk about the temple, which Krishna Prem represented as a magical point of interaction between this world and the powers of divinity, inspiring harmony and fanning the flame of the spirit in men's heart. The symbols and rituals of worship magically invoked the presence of divinity and stirred resonances within their human witnesses. He said the circular integrating motion of the offerings around the images on the altar corresponded with the integrating movements of thought around a divinity within the human heart. And he spoke of the integrating effects of actions dedicated to the divine and centered on the temple images. I had met people who fervently assured me that all things could be controlled by words of power if only they knew them, that misfortunes could be averted by the wearing of certain jewels, though they suffered misfortune, and while their eyes bulge, that bowel washes were the cure for all bodily and spiritual ills, and they all seemed just a little bit of off it. They were fanatics, persuading others of what they themselves secretly doubted, or substituting physical correlates for their psychic uh, antecedents. antecedents. But Krishna Prem was not a missionary. He did not attempt to persuade me or anyone else uh, that he held the keys to these or any other mysteries. He did not try to hold me with a glittering eye, nor did his eyes bulge, nor did he grow fervent or and inarticulate. If one challenged a statement that seemed extravagant, he supported it with examples taken from experience without mystery mongering or laying claim to superior knowledge. Unlike most religious instructors, when he did not know the answer to a question, he simply said, I don't know. Wherever one touched a man, he rang true. At this distance in time, over 25 years, I cannot exactly reproduce either his words or even the idea he expressed. As the years progressed, his ideas changed and matured, but at the time, I was not looking for perfection. 2 years earlier, I had seen the South Indian Saint Ramana Maharshi, the radiance of whose attainment was almost visible. But he was too far removed from my muddled state for me to relate his teaching to the practical necessities of living. At the time, I did not see in Krishna Prem what I had seen in Ramana, but perhaps it was just because of this that I felt close enough to him for his words to have practical application. For me, tired of the clamor of military aircraft engines and the petty intrigues of my colleagues, tired of war and disillusioned of my British heritage, Krishna Prem's portrayal of an ultimately meaningful life was uplifting. He was conjuring up glowing images, opening new worlds to my view. But was it true? Was he articulating his experience, or was he just playing with glittering words? Sitting on an outcrop of rock beside the temple one morning, he was answering some of the questions I had saved up for him to ask him. Then I challenged him. What I asked, does all this mean to you yourself? He was silent for a moment, and the flush that came to his face made his eyes seem even more blue. He gave me a very simple, straight answer. I have never remembered what he said on that occasion. Perhaps I hardly heard the words because it came to me with the shock that I had got through his outer armor, and for a moment, then the man behind. It was the sort of man I had never seen before. Simple, in the sense of uncomplicated, clean, soft, and sunlike. I was torn between embarrassment at my intrusion and desire to feast my soul on such a rare beauty. For the next few days, I felt like the country bumpkin of legend who stumbled into fairyland. Moti did one of her tin soldier acts, spraining her knee, and I was appointed her mobile walking stick. At 30, she was already a sick woman, destined to die from kidney disease within 5 years. But despite this and the host of minor ailments, she was vibrantly alive. At first, one saw her as a laughing, teasing, vivacious girl and wondered what this colorful man was doing in the remote Himalayas. Her spirit was mercurial, leaping from laughter to anger, from gentle wheedling to imperious command. She would read Plato with us as much zest as she read Winnie the Pooh, and I have seen her rout Krishna Prem and a professor of philosophy. in philosophical arguments, primarily capping her victory with "I got a gold medal for logic at school." Just as Krishna Krem hid behind intellectual armor, Moti hid the beauty of her nature behind a screen of laughter. Like Jalal ud-Din Rumi's, her jokes were not jokes, they were teachings. It took me a long time to come to terms with this side of Moti, and to understand why Krishna Prem was as devoted to his guru's daughter as he had been to his guru. Though Krishna Prem was head of the ashram, expounded the teaching, and had won public acclaim as author, devotee, and man of considerable attainment, Moti, with her Hindu birthright, managed the day-to-day affairs that was acceptable. The great man, needed someone to hold after worldly details while his mind roamed free in the infinite. What was not so easily acceptable was that Moti produced emotionally charged situations which compelled one to practice the teachings which Krishna Prem had articulated in relative calm, so great as the split between ideas and their implementation that few people understood what was happening. We all admire Krishna Prem and we all loved Moti, yet we all found Moti a very difficult person to live with. In fact, I knew only one man who had saw the point in her behavior. That was Dr. Boshi Sen, a famous Indian scientist living in Almora. Once, when Moti was bludgeoning me uh, with one of her tantrums in his presence, he laughed delightedly at the sight that was enough to embarrass or even to frighten most men. His own guru had treated him in a similar way. Moti had an exceptional capacities in the realm of psychic phenomena, and I once spoke to her regretfully of my own lack in this field. "What do you want with these things?" she replied. "They are crooked, deceitful, and womanly, like the moon." Try to become more like Krishna Prem. In him, I see the straightness, the trueness of the sun. Yet there is no denying the beauty and fascination of the moon. Moti's inner beauty, Moti's inner beauty might at times have been shrouded by storm clouds, but the longer I knew her, the more I became aware that her passionate nature was utterly dedicated to the spirit, regardless of what it was, regardless of what it cost her. If she undertook to help someone on his path, she would spare neither herself nor him in the effort to change his nature, shatter it to bits, and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire. Though the modes were different, it was the same aspiration that flamed both in Krishna, in both Krishna and Moti. A rapier in the hands of Krishna Prem, a scimitar in Moti's, and in both of them, laughter bubbles like a spring of clear, refreshing water. However, none of this was shown to me until I was well and truly hooked. For the moment, I was dazed and disoriented. The winds had blown the castaway to shore on the islands of the blessed. It was a magic island above the clouds, a dream, and a dream might end. Moti started to knit me a pullover. Esther and I visited more friends in the neighborhood, and we then planned to travel south, ending our journey at Ramana Maharshi's ashram in South India, where I would decide the future course of my life, or so I thought. But Esther needed a fortnight to settle her affairs, so she suggested that I return to Krishna Prem's ashram for that period. Krishna Prem, the reputed hater of visitors, agreed. After a 50-mile trek through the crystal clear air of the October hills, I reached the ashram to be scolded by Moti for not sending her a telepathic message. The pullover was ready. I think she had knitted me into it. At the end of the fortnight, I was given permission to stay on indefinitely. The little ashram was filling up with the 4 or 5 visitors it took to fill it. And Bob was from back from Badrinath. I now occupied a 6 foot by 8 foot cell on the ground floor of the temple. But though closer to the life of the ashram, I was also more excluded because most of the talk was in Bengali, which Krishna Prem talked fluently, to the delight of his Bengali friends. I noticed that he slipped into a more feeling mode of expression when talking Bengali than when conversing in English, and he seemed able to adapt himself to the needs of people, communicating with the simple old peasant woman as easily as he had did with a sophisticated intellectual. He had gained a reputation for his knowledge of Sanskrit, which he said he did not deserve because he did not know the language well, but simply made good use of the little he did know. He had studied Pali at Cambridge, where he first became interested in Buddhism as a branch of theosophy, and had taken a Buddhist initiation. There he had filled his rooms with Buddhist paraphernalia, including a Chinese Buddha image and Tibetan Ankas given him by his father, who mildly encouraged his eldest son's exotic tastes. His Christian Scientist mother found his room too full of confusion to suit her. One heard much about Cambridge, the post-war years at King's College gave him and his friends occasion for a rich expansion of interests. They were not immature youths, straight from school, but men whose manhood had been thrust early upon them by the hardships and stresses of war. Perhaps it is natural for intelligent men to turn from enforced contemplation of death to a search for the meaning of life, whatsoever the reason might be. There was a group of friends linked by the community of interest which showed itself in their joining various branches of the Theosophical Society and allied movements, Buddhist, Masonic, the Liberal Catholic Church, and the Healing Group that broke up abruptly when a number of their patients died. And when there was the airy fairy Lillian, who had ran an occultic meditation group building thought forms and sending members on astral journeys, which movement they joined. They lit their lamps at its flame and then carried them through life, some brightly, some dimly, but they all seem to have stayed alight. These men were, in some sense, pioneers of the present worldwide movement that sends thousands of people searching for an exotic faiths, for a spiritually meaningful interpretation of existence. Like them, Ronald Nixon was in revolt against regimentation, against the senselessness of war, and against material values. Like them, he rejected the hollow promises of social reform and sought instead a personal solution to all the problems of life. And like many of them, he turned towards India, a land of the Buddha, of Apollonius, of Tyanas, mysterious Brahmins, of Alexander's gymnosophists, gymnosophists, of the masters of Blavatsky's Theosophical Society, of the Upanishads, and of yoga. From a nonconformist school at Taunton, Ronald won an exhibition in science in King's College. But the war intervened and he went up to Cambridge after demobilization from the Royal Flying Corps. With his exhibition, a government grant for interrupted studies, and generous help from the college, he got through his course without financial help from his family. His tutor told him that the least important part of his life at Cambridge was attending lectures, and Ronald took the advice seriously. It was not that he did not work, he did no work. He was blessed with the photographic memory and had only to read a book once to be able to recall where any passage appeared. The unpleasantness of war had sated his appetite for applied science. The college allowed him to change his course to the mental and the moral science triples, and he sailed off with enthusiasm into the world of philosophy and literature. The event that seems to have marked the beginning of his inner life was a visit to the British Museum, where he was confronted by the Chinese Lohan Buddha, then impressively placed in the main entrance hall. In the utterly calm poise of that severe image, he sensed the reality of an attainment to which he could dedicate his life. There was then still doubt as to the Buddha's historic as opposed to mythic status. Ronald argued that historicity had no necessary bearing on what was depicted in as an image made hundreds of years after the Buddha's death. An artist can project into his medium only what is, or potentially is, in the human heart. If a man can portray in an image the calm poise of the indrawn spirit, then such a state is attainable by man. What can be attained? He went on to argue an endless time must have been attained, whether by the Buddha or by someone else. What one man can attain, another can attain. And so he set foot on the journey of the soul. At the end of his time at Cambridge, he sought some means of getting to India, where he felt one might yet find men who taught from experience the way to the Buddha's world descending poise. Applications for a teaching job in India led to his being interviewed in London. The interviewer approved, gave dangerous advice on the necessity of taking purgatives daily in the tropics, and advanced the now penniless Ronald money for his fare to Lucknow, where he was able, where he was to be reader in English at the university. These foreign appointments are all very well for people who have no home ties, complained his mother. And the strength of those ties, thought Ronald, is just why I have to go. From the moment of his arrival to Lucknow, Ronald fell in love with India and her people. Younger than many of his students, he associated with him and with his Indian colleagues, and he had ignored the British community, seeing that this behavior would lead to the brilliant and irrepressible young professor being ostracized by the British. Dr. Chakravarti, the Bengali vice chancellor, invited Ronald to stay permanently in his guest house. Chakravarti was himself an ardent theosophist and deeply sympathized with Ronald's spiritual search. Ronald's affinity for Indians and their way of life put him in an unusual position. An unwritten code ruled British society in India. Newcomers were expected to adhere to the establishment, live British, eat British, join the British Club, and pay duty calls on any senior man from the immediate boss up to the governor of the province. Relationships with Indians were defined crudely or subtly according to the class levels on either side. Anyone who went too far was cold-shouldered, blackballed from the club, abandoned by his British clients, or sent home by the next boat, depending on the power and the community would, could wield over the individual. The system generally ensured that newcomers either conformed or left. Ronald did neither. His survival in the face of British disapproval was partly due to the vice chancellor's patronage, for Dr. Chakravarti was a friend of the state governor, Sir Harcourt Butler, who was himself a highly unorthodox official. The British could not effectively complain at young Professor Nixon flouting their conventions, yet anyone who has not seen India under the British Raj will have difficulty in appreciating the degree of independence and moral courage needed to withstand the coercive pressures of the system. Ronald made many Indian friends. His shining countenance caught their imagination, and I still meet gray haired old men whose faces light up when they talk of their Professor Nixon, even though they were members of a class of 300 scientist students who attended Ronald's lectures only once a week. Their memory is of Ronald racing past them at excessive speed on his motorcycle, but so inexact is their memory of a mythologized Ronald that men who were his students when I was in the cradle have joyfully claimed me as their hero. Ronald's strong individualism protected him from the influencers, which usually molded young Englishmen into puka shaheeds. Sometimes, however, he ran foul of officialdom, once by cavalierly overtaking the Lucknow superintendent of police, also on the motorcycle, an event that led to threats to have his passport canceled. He was not aggressively rebellious. He simply went his own way. There was no venom in the man, so his British colleagues grew accustomed to his eccentricities. At Cambridge, he had been a ready and ruthless debater, and since he never lost his temper, even under provocation, unfriendly taunts were apt to boomerang. Since he did not want to join the British Club, the British could gain no satisfaction by blackballing him. Since he did not want their company, there was no point in ostracizing him. Since he was undeniably good at his job, they could not, with the with the Bengali as vice chancellor, have him removed for failure to confront to British standards of racial discrimination. Since he treated them without rancor, they ended by being friendly enough. Ronald spent his time studying Pali and Sanskrit, organizing student theatricals, and casting around in search of a spiritual teacher. His friendship with the Chakravarti family developed to the point where he was treated like an adopted son. And the longer he knew them, the more he came to appreciate the exceptional qualities of Dr. Chakravarti and his wife. The tall, dignified Dr. Chakravarti, then in Bengali, led a curiously double life. His personal quarters were furnished in material in Western style, and his table was the same. He neither drank nor smoked. His inner life, which one might call theosophisticalized, good one, Hindu, was shared with only a small circle of friends throughout his life, wherever he might be staying. He rose at 3 and meditated until 6 in the morning. He made he had met Madame Blavatsky, joined the, the Theosophical Society, and became General Secretary of the Indian branch. Annie Besant was a close friend and was much influenced by him. His wife, Monica, had persuaded him to allow her to meet as many as possible of the spiritual figures of the day in pursuit of her own search, but had ended by asking initiation from him because, she said, he had found no one his equal. Ronald once asked Chakravarti what sort of woman Blavatsky was. One would have had to know that fiery and tempestuous nature to appreciate his reply. I have known only one woman like her, and he nodded towards his wife, who was sitting a few feet away. With one side of her mature, Monica Chakravarti would mother anyone or anything that stirred her compassion, from men in trouble to an orphan litter of puppies which she suckled. She played the social part of Mrs. Vice Chancellor with cultured refinement and entertained her husband's distinguished guests. On the other hand, she hobnobbed with outlandish religious mendicants and had a fund of peasant women's crude saying that she could use to great effect. Unlike her husband, she held that if a man has anything of spiritual worth within him, it will show on the outside. As a consequence, she neither hid her own lamp under a bushel of conventionalists, conventionalities, conventionalities, mm, nor did she object to the eccentricities, eccentricities, gotta get that one, of dress and behavior and others seeking the same goal. Traveling in Europe with her husband and Annie Besant, she was mobbed by a crowd in St. Peter's at Rome. Dark, big eyed, beautiful, and wearing a blue sari embroidered with silver stars. She was taken for the Virgin Mary. The crowd tore pieces off her garments for sacred relics. Annie bustled into Annie bustled her into a cab and admonished her never to wear that sari again. And when dressed in all of her finery at the Paris exhibition of 1902, she was thought to be the Queen of Madagascar. Even Queen Victoria, seeing Monica from her coach at Windsor, sent her a summons to the palace. Ronald's, Ronald respected Dr. Chakravarti highly, but he felt Mrs. Chakravarti to be the greater of the two. The event, which marked the beginning of his devotion to his guru, occurred when he was spending a holiday with the Chakravarti family at Almora. Mrs. Chakravarti agreed to teach him Hindi and made him read from a Hindi version of the life of Krishna. As he read, she explained and commented when she spoke of Sri Krishna, he told me it was as if Krishna was in the next room. One could not see him, but he was there. A few months later, Ronald asked her for initiation. Apart from insisting on vegetarianism, which is incumbent on members of the Krishna cult, she made only one condition. As she put it, he must stick the old Indian concept of self-dedication and obedience to the guru invested initiation with great seriousness under the influence of theosophy. Europeans began seeking Oriental initiations, but they did not appreciate the single-pointed loyalty expected of initiates. When the novelty of one initiation wore off, they would take another elsewhere. For this reason, Dr. Chakravarti flatly refused initiation to several Europeans who applied to him. They don't stick, he said. They expect to get something, put it in their pockets, and go back to Europe. This was the basis for his wife's stressing the point. Vegetarianism was no problem for Ronald, who had been brought up that way by his mother. Although a year later, Monica Chakravarti received an overwhelming vision of the unity of being, which to her represented the culmination of her life's dedication to the spiritual path. The following day, she sent a note to Ronald written in Hindi. What are you seeking that I have found? Dr. Chakravarti's retirement in 1926 put Ronald in a position where he had to clarify his priorities. And the Chakravartis were going to live in Benares. Ronald's lucky, lucky now, Ronald's Lucknow job was well paid, and his now proven abilities assured him a career. But if he stayed there, he would seldom see his gurus. If he moved with his gurus, he would have to take a job at the Benares Hindu University as one third his current salary. His colleagues advised him strongly against going. Dr. and Mrs. Chakravarti refused to influence his decision, but Chakravarti gave advice. Whenever I have to make a major decision in my life, he said, I try to follow what I feel to be highest in myself. I have not always succeeded. When I have never had occasion to regret it. When I have not, I have always regretted it. That was enough for Ronald, and he went to Benares. 18 months later, doctors told Mrs. Chakravarti that her lungs would not stand another hot season in the plains, and she must go to the hills. To the motherly woman who had adopted 40 children and had four of her own, this was a severe blow. But it seems that the far reach effects of her vision were making it increasingly difficult to tolerate what, in contrast to her vision of eternity, were the meaningless trivialities of family life. Because of high blood pressure, her husband could not accompany her, and she therefore asked his permission to take monastic orders. If she had to leave home under such circumstances, she would leave it entirely and fulfill a lifelong ambition by building a temple to Sri Krishna and stay there in his service. Again, faced with the decision between his career and his guru, this time Ronald did not hesitate, but accompanied Mrs. Shivakutari when she left. She chose to go to Almora, where her husband had friends. As her guru, Dr. Chakravarti invested her with the robes of the Vaishnava order of Vigaris, and she took the name Sri Yashodamai. Sri Yashodamai then inducted then, yeah, then inducted her disciple, Ronald Nixon, into the order and gave him the name Sri Krishna Prem. During the 2 years it took them to find and acquire a system for the temple, Krishna Prem had to beg from the door to door for food and to obey the strictest rule of Hindu orthodoxy. By 1930, they were settled in the ashram, and within a year, the temple was built and images of Sri Krishna and his consort Radha instead are consecrated. A handful of disciples collected, some of whom built cottages for themselves, cultivated terraces, provided most of their basic needs. The disciple Yashodamai imposed on her followers. That was an orthodox Hinduism, a system so complex and far reaching that if followed with sincerity, there is no single action, feeling, or thought that can be separated from the sacramental attitudes towards living. It practices its practice and can give rise to an acute sense of self awareness. For one must be aware at all times of one's state of ritual purity. To, to be aware of it, one must be constantly watchful of even casual actions and contacts. And to maintain it, one must be ready to take the appropriate purificatory measures when the ashram was under several feet of snow. Measures such as bathing were not the pleasurable relaxation that a ritual dip in the temple tank can be in the heat of the plains. Yashoda was not an easy taskmaster. She admitted to having had trouble with her temper when young, and even as a mature and elderly woman, she could make sense of the scene. Having seen having seen the daughter blowing the roof off, I can imagine what the mother was like. However, she treated Krishna Prem with such consistent gentleness that he complained she was making things too easy for him. He had seen her treatment of others. With warm-hearted motherliness, Yashodamai would agree to some man settling at the ashram under her guidance and make all necessary arrangements for his well-being. But then she would, as Krishna Prem put it, turn the pressure on. Non-observance of the ashram rules, personal habits such as nose picking, laziness, failure to show due respect to the guru, or even mistakes of ordinary speech might call forth sharp criticism, spiced with crude analogies. She hit below the belt, saying the things other people only think, as if the polite pretenses of social customs do not exist. If anyone answered back, it was a signal for a detailed listing of his shortcomings, which might culminate with his being told how distasteful it was for the deity to have such a loathsome creature about the place. Although invariably the poor fell follow, but the poor fellow would take his loathsomeness away. Krishna Prem never quite understood why she did it. By ordinary standards, Krishna Prem Krishna Prem's life was not easy. The fact that he thought it was when others thought it was not may account for the reputation of gaining your devotion to the Guru. He was constantly at her side, nursing her in her increasingly frequent periods of illness, performing the temple rituals, which included preparation of the ashram food, managing the ashram affairs, and expanding and expounding his guru's teachings to visitors. And in the long winter evenings, his he would read aloud while Yashodamai knitted, embroidered, or made carpets. In 1930, when the temple was being built and Yashodamai was staying in the ramshackle cottage up the hill, Dr. Alexander made a visit. Yashodamai asked him to examine her and to give an estate on her life expectancy. She was ill and wanted to know how much time she had to make something at her disciples. The doctor gave her 2 years at the outside, but she lived to have a chastened Alexander who joined the ashram 8 years later, and she died in 1944 after appointing Krishna Prem as her successor. Krishna Prem accepted the responsibilities of both ashram and the disciples, but he once told me he would have preferred the wandering life of a mendicant. I sometimes found him in a depressed mood. I found that puzzled me until I noticed that these moods coincided with the approach of the holiday seasons when visitors and disciples were expected, and he would have to submit to their demands for attention. There were few visitors in those days. The 18-mile walk deterred all but the most hardy. I have indicated the complementary manner in which Krishna Prem and Moti Rani shared the responsibility for running the ashram. Krishna Prem teaching through speech and Moti through behavior. I do not mean to suggest that Krishna Prem's teachings are theoretical, was theoretical. One of my earliest memories of the ashram is one of sprawling in the afternoon sun on Moti's veranda. Krishna Prem had been sent a pamphlet of the scores of Indian sadhus protus, expressing the writer's particular teachings or exhortation to society. He threw it across to me with a "take a look at that." When I had finished reading, "Will," he said, "is it there? Is it where?" He fumbled. I fumbled. The thing, he said, is the thing, the spirit in that pamphlet. How should I know? I countered. But you must know. You must be able to recognize whether he is writing from experience or whether it is just words hearsay. Some of the things he says seem true. I ventured. The reply was devastating. One can't write anything on this subject without saying something that is true. What you must see is whether the truth shines through the words or whether they are platitudes, words repeated by roti. Look behind the words. Feel. I felt as much I felt I felt as might a man blind from birth suddenly ordered to see. I felt as inadequate as a donkey with two legs. He might as well have said fly. That was the way he treated me, forcing me to see that it was not just a matter of having a superior mind or of my not knowing the jargon, but that there was a range of perceptions of a different order, which he had and I had not. And since he never pretended to be anything more than an extraordinary man, I could not take refuge in the plea that he was extraordinary and that nothing could be expected of ordinary mortals like me. It was the other way around. He was asking me to be as normal as himself and share with him everyday elements of his experience. That was why I felt such a fool. He was holding out something for me to take. He was holding it, and I would not see what there was to take hold of. A few evenings later, I was sitting in his room. Look at the psychic content of those books, he said, waving towards the yellow painted pine shells that filled one wall. I took and felt a familiar numbness creeping over my brain that would reduce my contributions to monosyllables. See their inner content? He continued, and I was not referring to the paper and print, nor even to the information they contained. And he went on talking of symbols and correspondences, planets and medicinal herbs, consciousness and form, the levels of the universe, ghosts, dreams, Mahatmas, rituals, gestures, and their magical effects, and psychic phenomena until the very planks we sat on were surface appearances, bubbles of illusion brought into being by the consciousness of the levels. He would pile up conceptual images and set them glowing, lightened philosophies with laughter, lead his audience to high seriousness, then drop to trivial gossips, and catching at a thread, drawn, draw them up again. One cannot reproduce such talk, and little purpose would be served if one could. On these occasions, his purpose was not to teach, but to inspire. Many men can talk on a wide range of subjects and hold an audience with a show of learning and wit. University professors make a living out of it. As Krishna Prem once said, living like yogis on air, hot air. Krishna Prem's own and passionate dedication to the spirit infused everything he said. Visitors would leave him charged, not merely with his play of original and interesting ideas, but with some spark drawn from Krishna Prem's own unshakable certainty, when, as sometimes happened, a departed visitor would write, ask him to repeat his talk on paper. Krishna Prem would smile ruefully. The point had never been. The point had been missed. It was not what was said that mattered, but what came through the words. If anyone grasped the certainty, nursing, and spark of inspiration, then, when occasion permitted, Krishna Prem would turn to shorter and more practical instructions. He never lectured in the monologue. The talks were or conversational meetings in which visitors were expected to participate. Contrived questions were disposed or of shortly. For he objected, he said, to being treated like a model engine at a showcase where people could put a coin in the slot to see the wheels go around. And if anyone produced a written list of questions, or worse still, a paper and pencil to recover the answers, he might refuse to talk at all. But when people came with personal questions and problems, he might give up. He might give of himself until he was drained of energy. How much he gave depended on the particular case, for he seemed able to sense the integrity of the questionnaire, piercing the screen of words to try him with the touchstone of his heart. I am not suggesting that he was omniscient Superman with X-ray eyes. Like anyone learning his trade, he made mistakes, but there were a few who could deceive him because he did not deceive himself. This sort of insight was more than psychological skill, for men like Krishna Prem have added another dimension to their beings, and they view others from that vantage point. Unlike a physician who tends to equate a man with his body, or a psychologist who tends to equate a man with his mental and emotional complex, Krishna Prem equated a man with his spirit. Although such a statement passes the limits of most of man's comprehension, it is the simple truth, literal. The spiritual dimensions are potentially preset in all men, dormant like a seed. Sometimes Krishna Prem will see a sprout, will see it see a seed sprout, and a joy. Then that joy was recompensed for all his years of effort. Proselyte, proselytizing was abhorrent to him. He did not want anyone to follow him or to join the particular sect to which he was outwardly afflicted. If he wanted anything, it was that people should get a feeling for the essential and non denominational truth and grope their way towards it by any means that suited their particular their characters, and idiosyncrasies. One difference between Moti and her mother was that there, where was Yashoda, Mai treated her favorites more gently than other disciples. Moti concentrated her wrath on those who were closest to her. Poor young man, said Krishna Prem, when he saw Moti begin to take an interest in me. But it was also poor Sri Krishna Prem, for Moti devoted the last few years of her life to giving him the treatment her mother had spared him. It seemed that her object was to smash the barriers of intellectual indifference which Krishna Prem habitually raised between himself and others as protection from painful involvement. She relied she relied on his affection for her bearing of strain of the suffering she imposed on him. If it held, he would come to accept emotional pain as an essential part of his life against which one must erect barriers when one aspires to psychic wholeness. If one cannot accept it, one cannot transcend the Dwandas, the Dwandas, the opposites. For one is accepting only the gentle aspect of divinity and avoiding the harsh. Krishna Prem emerges from the ordeal a softer, kinder, and very much wiser man. The barriers were gone, so that people who knew him only in his later years remember him even more from the unrestricted warmth of his affection than for the brilliance of his expositions of the spiritual path. The brilliance remained, but it was more of a soft glow of a pearl, that pearl of great price, than the hard glitter of the diamond mind. As he says in the article entitled Symbolism and Knowledge, feeling and thought have to be fused into a unity. It was some 10 years ago after Modi's death. Before that fusion was complete, then, as if drawn by a magnetic, visitors began to flood a little ashram. The man who had previously resented the least invasion, the least invasion of his privacy, now opened his heart to these travelers on the dusty road of life, constantly given of himself. He now embodied the truths he had previously so keenly perceived. So it was now the man and not simply the cogency and clarity of his thought that impressed people who met him. Previously, he had given expression to the truth in a glittering parade of words. Now it was as if the wordless truth shone through him, so that people often found as much teaching in his casual acts and gestures as they had done in his books. During those intervening years, he had learned to distinguish between the accessories to the religious path and the essentials, which are not in any ordinary sense religious. He gradually abandoned the rigid framework of Orthodox Hindu discipline, which contained and guided his early growth. He simplified the temple ritual, retaining only those parts of the ceremonies that speak directly to the human soul. He disposed of the ashram library, keeping only such books as he felt would be of direct value to his disciples. And he radically altered his personal behavior. It was no easy task to break from a discipline which had ruled his actions for 25 years. But in face of what he had found, the detailed prescriptions of any orthodoxy was inessential trivialities. He saw no purpose in imposing them on a later generation of seekers whose social climate differed both from and of upbringing and from that of his adoption. Both East and West were changing. People were seeking in a less mythological, more direct mode than the strictly religious approaches provided for. He constantly urged his hearers to pass beyond the studies of theories and opinions and to press inwards to discover for themselves those realms of the spirit to which the different religions have given so many descriptions, though he never claimed authority for what he said. His quiet confidence and the practicality of his advice were evidence enough that he knew the way because he had traveled it himself. Neither he neither gave himself the airs of a conventional guru nor assumed a false humility. He cooked, cleaned, and worked about the temple and garden as unaffectedly as the most ordinary of them. To the to the end, he was intellectually active, studying Persian so as to read Jalal ud-Din Rumi in the original. Perhaps one of his most outstanding qualities showed itself in the way he would divest himself of authority, handing over the trusteeship of the ashram, the uncompleted manuscript of a book, responsibility for the temple management, even his personal correspondence, and the temple, even his responsibility. Okay, I messed up. Handing over the trustees of the ashram and uncompleted manuscripts of a book, responsibility for the temple management, even his personal correspondence, and the initiation and instruction of his followers to a disciple who was thereby forced to overcome his reluctance to face any such challenges. With the show of petulance, he would refuse to meet a group of visitors and send me to talk to them. I would reluctantly go, complaining that it would end by his having to see them as they would not be put off with a substitute. Then I would force myself to answer the standard questions with the standard answers, while I dripped close sweat from the effort to overthrow my shyness, and the visitors kept glancing in a direction from which they hoped Krishna Prem would appear. Then there was his unaffected pleasure when he walked in on one such session, and the visitors, engrossed in talk, barely noticed his presence. This was all part of his teaching, consonant with his goal of wholeness or perfection, though he lacked considerable stress. Meditative practices regarding them as the most essential part of the work. He held that the work is not complete until the whole from which all things have come is reflected in the wholeness of the man. A man under the sway of inhibitions and compulsions he regarded as partial or incomplete. If through fear one attempted to avoid certain areas of worldly experiences, then when one turned to meditation, the inner or psychic causes of that fear would rise up and bar one's progress. He therefore saw the work as a dialectical process, the facing of outer challenges opening the way to inner perception and self surrendering to the spirit in meditation, giving rise to the transpersonal courage with which the challenges of life can be met. That self surrender, he said, is the surrender of love, and the courage is the courage of love. During the protracted and painful illness which led to his death in 1965, he continued guiding his disciples, constantly demonstrating in a manner more powerful than words the supremacy of a human spirit over the sufferings of the body. The essays republished here were mostly written just before and during the first years of the Second World War. A few years before his death, Sir Krishna Prem intended editing this selection for publication, but the increasing demands of disciples and visitors prevented his taking the work in hand. I have attempted to select portions which are and always should be applicable to the problems of human life, removing only those sections whose relevance was strictly contemporary, with the exception of the opening passage of religion and philosophy, which appeared in a small magazine around 1925. The essays appeared as editorials and articles in the Review of Philosophy and Religion, published in Allahabad, for which Krishna Prem held joint editorial responsibility with his friend Professor R. N. Kaul. Two of the three essays formed the substance of a booklet, twice printed in India as Initiation into Yoga. This was so well received that it is again included here. Though these essays belong to Krishna Prem's earlier years and reflect his aspiration rather than the certainty of attainment, he felt that they still adequately represented his basic attitudes. and that is the end.